Author, psychiatrist, coach, and brain researcher, Dr. Srini Pillay is Phyllis's guest on Profonde TV. Dr. Pillay is one of Harvard Medical's most exciting innovators, challenging old theories about the brain.
What I've been noticing, because I follow the literature, is that suicide is increasing year after year in the US. So in the last 10 years, suicide has increased by 34%. Amongst millennials, the second leading cause of death is suicide. And when you talk to people on the street, they're like, well, I don't know what you're talking. I don't know anybody. Really? Seriously? And so part of what I thought is, what is going on that no one's noticing this was number one. Number two, what's going on in the workplace that we're not noticing that this is going on? And number three, can we actually do something in the workplace rather than just assume that people will automatically see psychiatrists, because they probably won't. And I think that, I did a series earlier this year with LinkedIn on depression, because they recognized that it was such a prevalent problem in America. And so it raised my level of awareness even more than usual, that in the workplace we have some serious problems. Millennials are really suffering. And I think it would be really helpful if leaders could take a look at this.
Well, when you say that they're suffering, what do you think is attributing to the suffering?
Well, if you actually just look at the psychiatric diagnoses, for example, the anxiety disorders are at 12%. They are, which is like twice the number of anxiety disorders than in baby boomers. Depression has increased by like 30% overall. In millennials, it's increased by 47%. And if you look at actual anxiety overall, 30 to 60% of millennials say that they're anxious, and they're also really perfectionistic. Now, if you ask, baby boomers in general, you ask people who are older than millennials, what's going on, they'll say, oh, these people they were brought up with silver spoons in their mouths. They don't know how to work hard. They're not really sort of with the program. They're all over the place. And that's not been my experience. My experience has been that of course, like in all age groups, there are people who pull their weight and people who don't pull their weight. But I think that millennials are facing some real challenges that perhaps other generations should be sensitized to. So, for example, when older people were growing up, they had a more stable sense of job security. Right? They were like, I could be training at that, and it's always going to be that. But with the advent of technology, you can train in one aspect of computer science, and after you graduate, it can become completely irrelevant and extinct. But by the same token, there's so much going on in the global financial crisis that millennials actually feel more unstable, because they feel like they're not really able to get up to the income level that they need to get to live the kinds of lives that their parents lived. So on the one hand, we have a group of people who are really suffering from depression, anxiety, who are actually more perfectionistic than other generations. On the other hand, we have a global financial landscape that's really changing, and we have a global work landscape that's really changing. And if you look at the studies where people ask millennials, listen, what's going on? Like, why are things so tough? What you see is consistently a certain number of factors. The first thing you see is that there's role confusion. So there's ambiguity. We talk about this as cross-functional teams, for example. Like many years ago in organizations, you did what you did. If you were in IT, you stayed in IT. If you were in design, you stayed in design. You didn't have to go and work in all these teams, which is a beautiful thing, but it still requires a certain amount of training, and it makes people really anxious. So I think that the first thing is that because these things are changing so much, there's a lot of role confusion and ambiguity. The second thing is that there's also role overload. So what millennials are finding is that they're being given a lot of work that's unrealistic, that they're not really able to approach. And they have a different sense of meaning, a different sense of purpose. They come from a different generation. So I think leaders should probably be aware of that and sort of try to think about what they want to do with that. In addition to that, there are conflicts at work, because there's this intergenerational conflict. So each generation, there's a lot of ageism in America in general, not just toward older people, but toward younger people. And I think what we need to do is a lot of people, because there's so much uncertainty, when there's uncertainty, it's a breeding ground for prejudice, because uncertainty makes people find in-groups. They will either find in-groups that are political, in-groups that are racial, in-groups that are age groups, but wherever you can find your people, you will go into that group and then start taking on people outside of that group. And part of the reason I wrote this article is I wanted to just sensitize us and invite people to a conversation and say, hey, haven't we had enough of this in-group, this, that, and the other? How about we just think about the fact that uncertainty, first of all, at a brain level, actually changes the brain so that 75% of people think that bad things are going to happen even when they're not going to happen. So a lot of people, when there's uncertainty, actually start to feel like some catastrophe is going to come about. Now, rather than just doing what I think is natural, which is to run into an in-group and say, I'm going to stay in this group. You know, I'm with the women, I'm with the men, I'm with this age group, I'm with that age group. Why don't we say, let's not give in to our temptation to be prejudiced, and instead start looking at all age groups and taking care of all age groups? Because perhaps, you know, every generation can learn from another generation, and perhaps we can learn from the millennials how not to be at work. So, you know, I wrote this because in my practice in psychiatry and in my executive coaching practice, I am seeing a lot of very talented people burn out really quickly. And so I just think it's time for us to become more sensitized to this and really to ask leaders, what are we doing within organizations and corporations to take care of millennials?
Allow me to push back just a little bit and ask you the following. I can see and absolutely honor the problems that you've described, but there's a big jump between being disconnected, being isolated, or being depressed and committing suicide. So what is it that is causing or allowing this horrific jump to suicide?
So a number of different things. If we look at it from a biochemical level, there's not actually such a big jump. So people with depression have lower serotonin levels in their brains. And one of the metabolites of serotonin is 5-hydroxyindole acid. So let's just think of it as a metabolite of serotonin. Well, when this is low in the cerebrospinal fluid, then this makes people more likely to commit suicide. So when depression is associated with low serotonin, the low serotonin in the cerebrospinal fluid is associated with a greater likelihood of killing yourself. So number one would be that. Number two, I think we're learning, and this I think is one of the biggest paradoxes of modern psychiatry, is that modern psychiatry is on the one hand really addressing a lot of these problems like depression. On the other hand, there are drugs like antidepressants that can increase the rate of suicide. So even people who are seeking help probably need to be aware of that. Then if we look at things psychologically and we ask, well, okay, it's one thing to be depressed or anxious. Why do you now feel like taking your own life away? And I think part of that has to do, if you think about it, like why would anybody want to just jump off the train of life? Part of it is if the ride is scary, right? I mean, if you're going somewhere and someone's saying to you, you're about to jump off a cliff, or you feel like you're on a roller coaster and you feel like something dangerous is going to happen, you're going to jump off that train because you feel like whatever else is happening in the course of life is not worth it. That journey is not worth it. So I think when millennials kill themselves, really what I think we would hypothesize they're feeling is, you know, maybe this is better than just living with this horrible pain of depression, which is higher than the general population. Maybe it's better than living with this torturesome anxiety, which is higher than the general population. And I think depending on the person, some people may be angry and rageful. But, you know, there's so much sort of, on the one hand, there's so much insanity really in the world right now when you look at the level of rage and the way it's expressed. But there's also a lot of regulation that clamps down people's personal expression. So as a result of this, there's also a tremendous need not to say what you're feeling, because there's so much political correctness around that everybody just keeps their own opinions to themselves and starts to store this inside. And I think for people who are suffering from depression or anxiety, this idea of not being able to express their rage means that rage that would ordinarily be expressed outward, excuse me, becomes expressed inward. And so they turn this rage inward to hurt themselves.
Wow. So I see that your discussion needs to happen, the changes need to happen on several levels. The changes have to happen in terms of societal permission to express oneself. So I noticed that even in myself, that, you know, it's better to act like there's nothing wrong than to really say how you're feeling inside. So we need to make it safe for people to say, things are not great, without that being a permanent tag of some sort. Okay.
Exactly.
And then the corporate, go right ahead.
No, I just think it's possible to do that, right? I mean, we should be, every human being understands that when you're in a social situation, you kind of have to twist yourself into something that you're not exactly, just to meet the social demands. But at a certain point, it becomes a little bit too much. And so, you know, I think I agree entirely. I think that to the extent that we can encourage free expression, to the extent that people can air their views on contentious issues safely, so that there's trust in the workforce. And I think the responsibility is really both on the organizations, but and if we're talking about millennials, also on the millennials. Because I think there's a way to express yourself. Right? If you go around attacking somebody for their point of view, then you're going to be attacked back, or you're going to be restrained. I think as a society in general, all sides really need to understand that a diversity of opinion is fantastic. We can learn from one another. People don't have to agree with me. You know, like when you ask me, like, what's the jump from depression to suicidality? You know, my heart is open to that question. And I think, what a great question. Like, let me try to see how I would account for that, as opposed to, you know, why are you asking me that? Or why don't you have this identical view? I think in the world, people seek the same views because they feel unsafe. And I think that there's a general need for safety for all people to be able to say what they're feeling, rather than going through periods of time where one group has a certain voice and the other group doesn't. And in this case, I'm really highlighting the voice of millennials. And I'm saying that I think millennials need to have a voice, and perhaps also need some help in expressing that voice responsibly.
Okay, well, I'm a parent of a millennial, so let's talk to the parents, because, you know, I do know of, you know, I worry about it all the time. You know, how do you distinguish between the typical young adult or late teenage anxiety and deep depression? How does a parent know what is genuine, something they should be genuinely concerned about?
So in terms of depression, part of what you want to look at is the pattern of feeling low, or the pattern of feeling blue. If it lasts for 2 weeks or longer, then you want to start paying attention to that, because 2 weeks of feeling down or blue every day, nearly every day, for most of the day is a pattern. And then you want to look to see if you have problems sleeping, problems eating, a decrease in interest in day-to-day activities, if you notice that your child's feeling guilty, if you notice that they're a little down on energy and concentration, and if they actually tell you that they're feeling slowed down, or if they tell you that they're feeling suicidal, you want to start to suspect that the depression matters. It's not just, you know, somebody feeling down. It's absolutely fine to just feel down. We all have down days. But if they're starting to behave that way, I think it's important to pay attention. I think with anxiety, there's also, you know, I think there are a lot of people who feel anxious. If you feel like the anxiety or the depression is disturbing your social functioning or your functioning at work, your social or occupational functioning, then you want to seek help. I think for parents, one of the things you may not recognize is that sometimes kids don't say, I need help. They just ask for attention in some way. So you might start to notice they're coming late, they're coming home beyond their curfew, or they're not getting their work done, or they're doing things that sound a little bit impulsive, or maybe a lot impulsive, rather than saying, listen, you've got to stop that behavior, which, of course you have to set some kind of limit to help protect them. At the same time, you want to say, and then let's also discuss what's going on, because if you're feeling something that's difficult to handle, I want to be able to help you. And I think, there's a lot of professional help out there. I think one of the things a lot of people don't realize is that when you're depressed or anxious, the very first person you should probably see professionally is your primary care physician or your psychiatrist. And that's because medical diseases like thyroid disease, anemia, diabetes, a lot of different conditions can actually cause depression and anxiety. So first you want to make sure that you're medically stable. And after that, you can decide, do I want medications? Do I want cognitive therapy? Do I want a deeper psychodynamic therapy? Do I want different kinds of provisions at work? Do I want to talk to people at work? Do I want to tell people what I'm going through? In this LinkedIn video series, part of what I thought about was, it's really tough for people to tell other people what they're going through, because the other part to your answer is that suicide in general and mental illnesses actually come with a lot of stigma, right? People will say about suicide, these are selfish people, they don't care about anybody else. Why can't they just suck it up and deal with it? Or if they're depressed, they say, God, they're real downers. Because everybody feels like they're protected. The truth is, the predictions are that a lot of people, close to 2/3 of people in the workforce today are going to experience very significant anxiety. So even if you're not anxious right now, you're most likely going to experience that level of anxiety.
I want to take a big left turn or right turn at the moment. In the old days, people would go to their priests or to the local shaman or rabbi for help in some way. Have we lost the institutions that people can go to for solace?
I don't think we've lost them. I think they're still there, but I would 100% support going to any of those institutions rather than doing nothing, firstly. And secondly, for some people, it's even better than traditional approaches like traditional medicine. So I think that in general, depending on the country, so for example, in the United Kingdom, there are a lot more people who are atheists than here. So it's hard for people to feel like they can turn to their religious institutions. I think in the US and throughout the world, there's been sort of a negative feeling about the Catholic Church. I think what people should distinguish is that the religion from the people who are there and the people who've done things that they don't appreciate. The people who've done things that they don't appreciate are not a reflection of the fundamental religion. If you read any holy book, if you read the Bible, the Quran, the Bhagavad Gita, the books do not prescribe these behaviors. The people who are in these behaviors are not representative of the book. So I would want to encourage people that whatever your religious denomination is, even if it isn't your religious denomination, be curious, find out. I find a lot of joy really in speaking to people across different religions. I find a lot of joy in connecting to meaning across religions. An example is I recently had an invitation to do a corporate gig with someone to teach neurocoaching. And the person I was talking to, and I call myself Hindu, but the person I was talking to, I just couldn't pay attention to what she was saying. And I said, I hope I'm not being racist, but I can't pay attention to you because while you're talking, all I can hear is a gospel range. And she looked at me, because she was an African-American woman, she looked at me and she said, actually, I am a gospel singer. And I said, really? I said, that's funny. Why don't we, and a week later, we started making a gospel album together, which connected neuroscience with gospel music. And we're now just about finished with the first round. And through that process, I got to delve into the Bible, get to think again about, I had already read the Bible, but I wanted to understand how to connect that with neuroscience. You can get a lot of meaning from religious institutions because the messages that are delivered through those institutions are age-old messages that I think are very solid anchors. I think even if you don't want to commit to any religion, be curious, ask questions, realize that there's support out there as you said, any kind of religious institution has people who can be there for you. So why not turn to them?
Okay, so I'm taking a risk in asking you this question. What does Dr. Pillay do at the moment? I don't mean the traditional dark cloud. I mean, we all have big losses. That's not where I'm going. Let's just say you're sitting at your desk and there's, you're just not pleased with something and the day seems to have a dark cloud. What do you do first when you notice that?
What do I do first? So I'll just say what comes to mind, and I'll try to assess the truth of what I'm saying, because I'm not sure that my first response is going to be truthful. I would say one of my go-tos for, in general, re-regulating my mind is transcendental meditation. So I've noticed throughout my life that going to a pattern of 20 minutes in the morning and 20 minutes in the evening of regular TM actually changes my consciousness, and it puts me in a different frame of mind, and it changes really what's going on. So that's number one. Number two, I've noticed aerobic exercise is really great. So if I can play tennis or hop on the elliptical just to bypass what's going on mentally, I will play tennis or hop on the elliptical. If I feel like talking to someone who's close to me and I know that they're around, I might pick up the phone, FaceTime someone, anyone who's close to me, and sort of just talk to them about something. In general, I am personally not, I don't get a lot out of just restating a problem. What if I were to call you and I was distressed, I would say, man, I'm in this funk, and I'm just thinking, and I can tell you why, but I'm just thinking, I know as a psychiatrist and a brain scientist, this is like rerouted electrical activity, and it's just stuff that's happening in my brain that I'm taking to be the absolute truth and real. And I want to just remember the stuff that matters to me. And I do believe in God. So I think for me personally, just remembering that sometimes whatever those dark places are and whatever those obstacles are, there are challenges that are there so that you can go past them, I think matters. I think when you've had major losses in your life, it puts all other challenges in a completely different perspective. So,
that's true, and that's probably the topic for a whole other discussion. But let's just go back. So I want to share about me for a moment.
Yeah.
One of the teachers, and I've read a lot of literature in Eastern thought, but the particular one that resonated for me is a man who's deceased named Krishnamurti. And he had an idea that at the moment you notice that you're off being present is the most powerful point that you have. So that the practice, the skill to develop is to catch yourself when you're not actually here now. Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh also has the same idea. Lots of gurus talk about it. But Krishnamurti had a secular approach to this, which was helpful. So you said something similar in your early answer, which is that you break the pattern, that you do something to take your mind away. You're not lying to yourself. You just get on the elliptical or you do something to stop the pattern. But you have to recognize, you catch yourself in that pattern. So that's why I wanted to go back to that. You notice that the brain is going where you don't want it to go. Some guru I used to study with talked about, and you probably know more about this, about the drunken monkey, that the brain is like a monkey that gets out of the cage. So when you're going down a dark path, you need to put the monkey back in the cage. So I just wanted to share that with you and get your assessment.
I love what you're saying. Actually, Krishnamurti is one of my favorite thinkers because I just love, one of the most striking conversations that he had that really impressed me was a conversation that he had in, I think it was 1967, with Houston Smith, who was a theologian at MIT. And Houston Smith said to Krishnamurti, how is it possible to be clear? Do you think lucidity is possible? And Krishnamurti said, yes, I think it's possible. And he said, well, that's amazing. And everybody was sort of waiting like, oh, now Krishnamurti is going to tell us how he achieves such fantastic lucidity. And he says to Krishnamurti, so how do you achieve such lucidity? And he says, by not asking the question how.
Ooh.
And he looks back and he says, well, that's a pretty unfair. He says, well, no, he said, lucidity is all about freedom from authority. So when you are in your moment, rather than asking Srini or Phyllis or somebody else or anybody, how do I get out of this place? What you do is you forget the authority and you become enlivened to the moment of your own life and your own intelligence. Which is, it's in some ways it's easier said than done, because when you're in that state, it's difficult to experience your own ingenuity. But I also think it's a really great message that within every human being, there is this capacity for us to save ourselves. And I think if we remember that that power resides with us, then we will remember that all the helpers in the world, the psychiatrists, the coaches, the rabbis, the Krishnamurtis, the uses, that all the helpers in the world are there to remind us of our own power, not to give us power that we don't have.
I am so moved by the fact that you have a practice that allows you to look at all kinds of input. It's a demonstration of how we started this conversation. You're not locked into a singular community approach to this problem of suicide or depression. You're looking at it holistically or from all angles. So, is there anything you want to add before we close?
I think mostly what I'd want, I guess there's two things for the millennials and then for the leaders in the corporations. I think for the millennials themselves, I'd want to say, remember, no matter how bad you're feeling, it is reversible. The brain can change, and it can change with ingenuity, with prayer, with medications, with therapies. It can change. So just remember that you can ride that through, and that death is not your only option. And I think to leaders within organizations, I would say, take care of the people within the organization, because the organization is just another house in life. And I think that to the extent that we all have people working for us, that we all are working for other people, I think the more we learn to take care of one another, and I mean this not just in a soft way, but in a thoughtful way. Like if we just remembered, you know what, we are actually better off taking care of one another. I think if we realize that really deeply, I think real changes can happen within organizations as well.
Thank you.